welcome to E Pluribusum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, 2 updates. 1, root canal that I just had not that long ago. I didn't really have any issues with the procedure, I don't think. You know, I'm keeping up to date and looking and making sure everything's alright. My permanent cap comes in 2 weeks, so hopefully things will be good until then. Also, doomerism, because I made a tweet and a thing in my Discord that was a very bleak message about the Patreon and this show and this channel and whatever. To be blunt, yes, that statement is 100% true. And I'll just say it. This year, I've been making every single video this year with the intention of potentially making this my last year on this channel. It's not something I want to happen, but it's something that is like, if things ain't changing, then literally there is no other option. Best case scenario, things just become a hell of a lot more infrequent. Maybe instead I do officially start the video essayist cycle and literally do only have to do 1 video a month. So anyways, if you can, give money to my Patreon, or send my Patreon to places that can give me money. If things don't change on that end by the end of the year, then things are gonna have to change on the upload schedule or whatever. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, the Spanish election just happened. The results were not as bleak as were originally thought, although some people are painting the results to be more good than they actually are. Let me explain the results. The results that have come out of the election are as follows. The People's Party got 136 seats, the PSOE got 122 seats, Vox got 33, Sumar got 31, the Republican Left of Catalonia got 7, Together for Catalonia, Junts got 7, EH got 6, the Basque National Party got 5, the Galician Nationalist Bloc got 1, and the Canadian Coalition also got 1. So, if you know anything about these Spanish elections, you know that that is not necessarily enough to form a governing coalition on either front, because the only parties that were guaranteed coalition building were the People's Party and Vox, and PSOE and Sumar. And let's just do some brief calculations so that we understand. 136 plus 33 is 169, when you need 176 to get a full majority, and 122 plus 31 is 153. Now, many people think, the right wing is in a better position, but then people started looking at the other parties that won seats, and many people were thinking, it would be a lot more even if you divided it up by partisan breakdown, but that's not necessarily how you should break down the partisan breakdown. And technically, they don't need that 176. They just need just enough of a majority to work in the government, which means they can go by with a simple majority. That is only if they have enough of a vote to actually manage to push through that. And one big misconception that I am seeing is a lot of people are de facto putting the Republican Left of Catalonia in the left-wing bloc. But that is not how it works. The Republican Left of Catalonia, like in their most recent investiture vote for the Pedro Sanchez government, they abstained. If we were to go purely based on how they voted in the last investiture vote, then the vote total would be the left-wing bloc gets 159 votes, and the right-wing bloc has 170 votes, which does put the right-wing bloc in a better position than it was before. But we recently got news that one of the abstentions from the last cycle, EH Bildu, has stated that they actually intend to vote for Sanchez in the upcoming election, which means that Pedro Sanchez has a better chance of forming the government than the right wing. So, yes, there is still, hope there. It's just that I want to make sure that the hope is not misguided. Speaking of misguided hope, this is something that is not misguided hope. It is a very bad thing. The Niger coup, for those who don't know, there is a country in Africa by the name of Niger, and yes, that is how you pronounce it. And currently, they're in the midst of a military coup. The president that was just deposed is a man by the name of Mohamed Bazoum, who is a member of the Nigerian Party for Democracy and Socialism, and was considered a key ally of the West in order to depose some Islamic rebels in the area. And the person who has taken over the position is a man by the name of Abdurrahmane Tchiani, also known as Omar Tchiani, saying that the president was hiding the harsh reality of the country, which he called a pile of dead, displaced, humiliation, and frustration. Criticizing the government, of course, I would assume that the criticisms is that he believes that the government isn't doing enough to combat foreign agents in the area, and he has given no indication that he is going to return civilian rule to the country anytime soon. Shocker. What makes this interesting is that this is apparently the 7th country in Northern Africa that has had a deposed leader since January of 2020. Scratch that, 7th successful coup. There were at least 2 other coups that were unsuccessful. I can't really say much about any of these areas. I don't know much about the African continent in regards to their politics and otherwise. All I know is that I hope the situation turns out better and it turns out good for Africa. Speaking of things that I hope turn out good, this is something that doesn't look like it will be turning out good. Okay, so for those who don't know, the British Labour Party has been steadily trying to do a Blairism 2.0. They've been trying to walk back a lot of controversies surrounding their further left members, particularly Jeremy Corbyn. You know, they've expelled him, they've expelled a lot of party members that are in alignment with Corbyn for quote-unquote unrelated reasons. They've tried to adapt their platform so that they're more palatable to the British people. Literally, again, Blairism 2.0. Tony Blair walked in basically saying, I'm going to make the British Labour Party more palatable by taking away all of our further left, loony left elements. And Keir Starmer is the person who is trying to do the same now. And one position that they have decided to start changing their mind on is trans rights. Now, they've stated that they will lead on reform for trans rights, and everybody's like on paper, that sounds like good. Like, they're going to fight and, like, you know, reforming trans rights, that's good. That usually seems like you want to make it better for trans people. But then you start looking into it, and a lot of things are not looking good. The biggest thing that many people point to is the fact that the Labour Party originally was proposing the idea of introducing the idea of having trans people self-identify themselves, making it like law in England, if they managed to get power, that trans people could self-ID themselves, be able to change their legal sex without needing any medical diagnosis. Because in the system that it is now in a lot of countries, you literally have to go through all these hoops and ladders to even be considered trans. It's almost the same thing in regards to immigration. Right-wingers seem to think that the process is so easy, when in fact all of the safeguards currently are like super complicated. Now, this has led to a lot of problems within their own party, because the Scottish Labour Party, like the Scottish faction of the British Labour Party, has already they already changed their party constitution to have self-ID trans laws be part of their manifesto. But now the National Party is considered to be at an antithesis to them. Speaking of Scotland, Scotland's actually one of the reasons why they are doing this. Because in Scotland, there was a huge issue in regards to their prominent left-wing party, the Scottish National Party, and trans rights, with some members of the party being hardcore trans supporters and others being hardcore TERFs. And that had led to a lot of infighting in their most recent election for a leader. And another force in the British quote-unquote left is George Galloway, who founded and made a party to oppose Labour, and basically made his wedge issue in that campaign trans rights, saying that he was going to be anti-woke. And each passing day, I'm wondering when Jeremy Corbyn's going to start his anti-Labour party, because he should just get to it at this point. He's getting a base. A lot of people are getting sick and tired of the British Labour Party. We just need the voice to fill the void. Now, going across the ocean to the United States, Matt Gaetz has introduced a bill, and the bill is very interesting, saying that he would end unqualified birthright citizenship for children whose parents are not themselves U.S. citizens. The legislation is called End Birthright Citizenship Fraud Act of 2023, which would amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to reflect the original intent of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, clause, according to a statement on the measure. Now, given the fact that this is a completely insane, idiotic idea that is basically racist in its inception, of course it is a mainstream talking point in the Republican Party now, with Trump apparently even toying with the idea of just doing this the day one when he gets into office in 2024, even though experts say that he can't do this. Let's just go over it like this. First of all, the bill was made in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War to give citizenship to all of the enslaved black people that were born in the United States. Now, me personally, I think all of the amendments on slavery are basically perfect and don't really need amending whatsoever. The only exception would be that one part where it's like, oh, they can be slaves if they're in prison. It's like, well, maybe we can get rid of that part. But otherwise, the amendments on slavery were perfect. Literally, it's just blatantly, if someone says they want to repeal or change certain laws, it's just an immediate red flag that they're racist. If they, it's one of those same things where it's like people who say we want to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's like, what? It would be the equivalent of someone saying they want to bring back the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's just blatantly right there. Why would you do this? Secondly, the bill is, of course, obviously, again, just racist in its intentions, because the conservatives, they think that there's this massive influx of women giving birth to children in the United States, and it's apparently a black market. They apparently think that there is a black market of women coming to the United States and giving birth to children and then going back. It is literally just what is the most basic point-blank definition of an American? Someone born in America. And now they're literally saying no, certain people, they're not even allowed to become Americans just by virtue of being born in America. What sense does that make? The bill does say that it excludes aliens lawfully admitted as refugees or permanent residents or performing active services in the U.S. Armed Forces. But it's wait, what is this? Is this a retroactive bill? And how many parents? Both parents or one? And second, how are we going to enforce the law? How are we going to enforce it? What is this? If it's a retroactive one or a current or a future one, how is this enforced? I don't get it. How is this even enforced? This is basically all those transgender laws where they're oh, we're going to ban trans people from going into certain areas. And then basically the only people who are tasked with trying to stop the trans people from coming in there are people that are trust me, I can tell. And then they literally beat an old woman to death because they could tell that she was a man. And it's no, I'm not kidding. Look it up. Woman with dementia, 86, beat up by thug and put in wheelie bin because he thought she was trans. That was a story in Ireland, and in America, literally the Florida bill to exclude trans people from going into the bathroom, a lesbian woman was kicked out of the bathroom by a male cop who had to enter the bathroom to throw her out because everyone could tell so bad. It's just so freaking... It's just so stupid. These laws are just so stupid. This is why I barely talk about conservatives, because it's just their reality is just so removed from the one that we live in that I literally just cannot even discuss anything with them because they're just so removed from the real world. Now, that's a bill that was introduced that is really bad. Let's talk about a bill that was introduced that's really good. Cori Bush has decided to introduce a bill that would end solitary confinement in federal prisons, jails, and detention centers. The End Solitary Confinement Act would cap the time incarcerated people and detainees are alone at 4 hours and would require prison or jail staff to meet with the inmate within 1 hour. The separation would be used as a de-escalation tactic in an emergency situation as opposed to punishment. Solitary confinement is a moral catastrophe, says Bush, adding that the practice is psychological torture. This practice is traumatic for people subjugated to it, harmful to communities, and isolating for loved ones, she said. Moreover, it is disproportionately inflicted on black and brown folks, young people, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized communities. None of the statements she said are wrong. In fact, all of them are 100% right, and the fact that we even use solitary confinement is objectively terrible. The whole criminal justice system we have now is just complete and utter BS, But at this point, it's just like, this is basically the first stepping stone to massive reforms in the criminal justice system. Speaking of massive reforms, here is a not so massive reform that was pushed in the Senate. Now, for those who don't know, the NDAA was just going on, and it of course passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, but it had 11 people who ultimately voted against it. Cory Booker, Mike Braun, Mike Lee, Ed Markey, Jeff Merkley, Rand Paul, Bernie Sanders, J.D. Vance, Elizabeth Warren, Peter Welch, and Ron Wyden. Most, if not all, of those votes are not really that surprising. They usually come from the non-interventionist slash basically, I guess non-interventionist really works in this context because it's multi-partisan. They come from their non-interventionist wings of both of the parties. The one thing that's kind of disappointing is the fact that one of the members of the Senate Progressive Squad isn't there, John K. Fetterman. I don't know if this was just the trajectory that he was going to regardless, or if this is just after his stroke, but it seems like Fetterman is definitely just going to be a bit more in line with, say, I can't even use the example that I was going to use, Warren, because Warren voted against this bill, but he's definitely gotten a little bit different in regards to, I guess he has moderated his stances to be more palatable to the world. Well, at least to the Senate. Now, what is very interesting is that right before the NDAA passed in the Senate, there was a bill, an amendment to the bill that was proposed, and the amendment in question was introduced by Bernie Sanders, and the amendment was to reduce military funding by 10%. And very similarly, it also, it didn't really do so hot. 11 senators voted for it, 88 voted against it. But these aren't the exact same 11 senators. The senators in question are Tammy Baldwin, Ed Markey, Jeff Merkley, Chris Murphy, Rand Paul, Bernie, Tina Smith, Chris Van Hollen, Elizabeth Warren, Peter Welch, and Ron Wyden. First of all, big notable fact that about the non-interventionist guys also just not really advocating for reducing the military budget, even though some of them are supposed to be deficit hawks. Interesting. But what is also interesting is that this bill was actually introduced not that long ago. It was one of the most recent ones that it was introduced in was in 2020, and it had a very different vote total. It originally had 23 yeas when it was passed the first time, and they were all Democrats. Rand Paul voted nay the last time it was in the Senate. Now, granted, some of the people who voted for it are no longer in the Senate, Patrick Leahy and Tom Udall, but a lot of the ones are still in the Senate. So they really have no excuse except for the fact that, I can't even really say it would have passed. It probably wouldn't have passed even regardless. But it was probably just them building up for future political careers. But it's weird because Cardin voted for it last time and not this time, even though he's on his way out. So there's really no political blowback that he could get. I guess in this day and age, people are just one of the things that people were decrying was the fact that Bernie Sanders introduced this bill right around the time that Russia is doing its thing in Ukraine, and it's irrelevant. If we cut the military budget by 10%, we'd still be fine, and we'd still be able to defeat Russia if we wanted to. Speaking of defeat, the world is getting more defeated because we just keep showing that 2024 is not the year we are sending our best. Because one thing that was funny is that there's this random perennial New Jersey candidate that has thrown his hat in the Republican ring. And apparently, this is how bad it was. He was basically groomed by the GOP to run in that seat that he wanted to run in last time. He was going to run for Congress in the seat that I think Jeff Van Drew holds right now. He was running for that seat. They groomed him to run for that seat, and then he lost to a nobody. But the more interesting candidate that is potentially throwing his hat in the ring is a representative by the name of Dean Phillips. Dean Phillips, who is in the district that neighbors Ilhan Omar, has apparently been tossed around by a bunch of Democratic donors with the intention of maybe having him run a long shot bid against Joe Biden in the upcoming 2024 election. Dean is, of course, a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, the group run by No Labels, who is currently pushing for Joe Biden, running against Joe Biden and or Donald Trump in the general election. His name was very interesting in the 2024 election cycle to begin with, because he was apparently, I think if I remember correctly, he was one of the couple of representatives in the House alongside the likes of Joe Cunningham, who is running the No Labels party now, alongside other people, including Angie Craig and Carolyn Maloney and Tim Ryan. I think progressives also floated the idea of maybe having Joe Biden step down in 2024. I think Ilhan Omar was floated. I think she also stated that she would be interested in having someone else run, but it was mostly dominated by the right-wing Democrats. You see, funnily enough, No Labels is literally doing the thing that I advocated for progressives to do for a lot of cycles, and I think a lot of people do advocate for progressives to do a lot. They're literally doing the two-pronged approach. They want Phillips to run in the primary, and then they're trying to push for someone else to run in the general election just in case their primary bid doesn't work. I say Dean should go for it, only because it probably guarantees me a video in the future, and also because that makes his seat an open seat, and I would much rather have that seat open so we can pick someone better. With that out of the way, let's move on to the main topic of this video. I've been doing YouTube for 5 years now. I started posting content on here when I was a little under 18, now I am 23. I am literally 2 years away from having my prefrontal cortex fully developed. I literally started this channel before I was even considered legally an adult, and now I am on the path. I'm 2 years away from not only being considered a legal adult, well, I mean, I'm already considered a legal adult, but also at the point where it's biologically I am considered an adult, because that is when the development of my body maturing has ceased. And then that, of course, starts the path on to the Middle Ages, which then puts you on the path of being old, then puts you on the path towards death. It's a bit weird. If you were to go by average American lifespan, which is 77.28 years, and we'll just roughly say 77, that means I have 54 years left until I die. And believe me, I'm trying to make sure that number is big. The end game number is big. Like you do when you get older, you do start to notice that's when things start changing. When you hit your 20s, if you're not in your 20s yet, kids, when you hit your 20s, you're gonna start thinking a bit more like, I'm not immortal. You're gonna start thinking, maybe instead of eating 2/3 of the pizza, maybe I'll only eat half of it today. Maybe I'll only eat 2 slices today. Maybe I should stop eating candy, maybe so I don't get a root canal. Maybe you should cut out sugar and all this fatty food out of your diet entirely. Otherwise, that number is going to be a lot smaller. Maybe you should stop using illicit substances. Granted, I don't use illicit substances. That's one of the reasons why I don't use illicit substances. It's what's the point? And even then, factors beyond your control can literally determine that's it. And a lot of that comes from you maturing. You do realize you grow, you develop. And due to this, I have grown and changed and developed. Some of which before your very eyes. And that is an interesting way to analyze YouTubers as well. YouTubers are basically, celebrities are what the common man become when they, get really, really big. But YouTubers are a bit different. See, celebrities do have, a branch above normal people, but YouTubers are vastly different because they sort of have that level, but they are literally still just common men. Well, I mean, except for the top ones. That has kind of changed with the internet as it has grown and changed and developed. First and foremost, their content. Their content grows and changes and develops. Look at my most recent video, and when I say my most recent video, I don't mean a podcast. Well, you can do that with my podcast too, but take the most recent episode of my highly edited series and then compare that with my first one. While yes, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of differences too. And do that with every YouTuber. YouTube finally put back the feature where they can look at the oldest content. So literally look at their most recent video, click the oldest, and then look at their oldest video, and you will see a vast change in their style and whatever. Because if they haven't, then that is kind of an issue. And that also stems from a different thing. Because you can do one more thing when you're looking at it. Not just analyze the content, but the man or woman or non-binary person or gender fluid person behind the screen. Their attitudes may be different. They might have gone through a lot of life experiences that have changed them. Or they just might have generally grown up. And that is also reflective in their content. For example, the kind of content that they make might be vastly different because they just grew out of it. Or they just don't really find a fascination with that type of content anymore. I am no exception. The world is a vastly different place than it was in May of 2018. Back in 2018, we had a website called Twitter that I used a lot, and well, actually, I was gonna say I had a lot of interactions and stuff on there, but no, early on I didn't really have that many interactions. 2019 to 2021, 2022, that was when I sort of like got like my peak in Twitter interactions, and then it dipped off again, mostly because I stopped associating with certain people. A big bummer was that was also the time period where it was like hype for collaborations, but I don't really have any like collab partners anymore. One decided to like dip from the internet entirely, and the other one basically, due to the fact that they have like a real life and actual things going on, they are mostly focused on that. And they don't really produce consistent enough content to warrant like collaborations that much. And all the other content creators that I know just don't want to collab at some point. I don't really get why. Like, I make myself very much open for content. Even when people do reach out for me to do content and stuff, it just never works out for some reason. I don't get it. Even though I'm the one who... Regardless, that's irrelevant. This one isn't really about the content and like collaborations or whatever. This is behind like... This is me talking about mostly like everything else, like ideologically or whatever. The first time I ever really noticed that I was really changing and whatever in regards to a subject was about Medicare for All. For starters, make no mistakes, I have supported it ever since 2016 and will continue to support it. But I originally subscribed to sort of like the secular talk, like I guess social democrat interpretation of it, where it's like, if you want supplemental private insurance, you can still get it. And then went, actually in the bill it does blah blah blah. But then I saw one too many people die because of the private healthcare insurance world, and I was like, this just ain't really it. And I started subscribing more to the Humanist Report style interpretation, where it's like, no, we should ban private insurance, and the bill does ban private insurance. For the record, they're both reading the same bill, and technically they're both right, but in a way, Humanist Report was more right than secular talk. And when I say they're both right, I mean they're both right in their interpretations of the bill, saying like, it says this. Because the bill technically does not ban private insurance. But what it does is that it bans private insurance from covering certain medical procedures. And then it proceeds to list medical procedures that the Medicare for All system would cover, which includes everything that is covered under most insurance policies, but then also lumps in stuff from oral and optical care policies. And essentially, the only thing that it did not cover was stuff that literally is just supplemental, like plastic surgery. Though you can make the case that certain plastic surgeries are not necessarily like supplemental. Some of them can be very needed. But, that's sort of like, that was the thing that was like the one thing that it didn't cover. And this discourse was revived when Nico House tried to say that, oh, no, you see what Tulsi's plan is actually the original plan, and what Jayapal is doing is worse and different, and that's why she doesn't support it. And it's like, this is just stupid. But anyways, we're going to use this time for me to basically explain a lot more of those things that have happened over the course of me making my show. What are positions that I held on political strategy, political figures, political ideology, political, positions? What are some things on those that I changed ever since starting this series. Now, you might say, didn't you kind of already do this with your My Ideology Nowadays video? Yes, but this is probably a bit more thorough, I think, because that one was a lot more off the cuff. For those who don't remember, my first episode of this podcast was basically me explaining my entire political philosophy at the time. I should probably make a reaction of that and then post it on the Patreon or something. That is actually not a bad idea, and I think I actually am going to do that, like, after I'm done making this episode. Or maybe tomorrow, since it's getting late. But anyways, let's not dilly-dally. Let's just get right to it. And to start off, I'm just going to immediately get into the biggest one that is probably the most noticeable. I am more left-wing than when I started the show. When I started the show, I originally identified myself as a social democrat. I still broadly identified myself with the larger left-wing movement. I wasn't like a sock emoji social democrat or like a globe emoji social democrat, which apparently exists. I didn't like differentiate myself from the left, basically consider myself part of the left-wing movement. Like I was like, I am center-left. But now I do not necessarily subscribe to calling myself center-left, especially in America where people for some reason consider the center-left to be people like Dean Phillips and Joe Cunningham. It basically became too much for me to explain, like, oh, I am a social democrat, center-left, blah, blah, blah. And it became much easier to just go, like, yeah, whatever. If you call me a socialist, whatever. But I do, like, subscribe to a lot of socialist thought and whatever. And funnily enough, I did actually identify myself as a socialist, like, in 2015, 2016, like, when Bernie Sanders first came around, but then after, like, it was actually the political compass that kind of ruined me, because the political compass gave me the whole, like, left libertarian or left populist or whatever, social democrat, like, stuff, and it's, like, that made me think about that, and it's, like, then I basically just looped back around to being a socialist. I called myself, at the time, like I was a socialist who didn't come out of the closet, I guess, and it was probably also due to the fact that we had this huge, like, you know, it was basically not cool to be a socialist until Bernie came around. And even then, people still, like, shorthand, like, look, socialism doesn't work. And I had a lot of friends that were, like, more right-leaning than I was. Like, I had a friend who was, like, a libertarian. Although he was in the left libertarian quadrant as well. So I don't really know, like, how right-wing he really was. Like, he definitely didn't buy into, like, a lot of the, like, right-wing social whatevers. But he definitely was no, like, lefty in regards to economics. But it was mostly just like the vague, like socialism doesn't work because XYZ. And I sort of probably like had that in my mind. And that's why I'm like, look, you see, I'm not a socialist, but I just believe we could take some of the good aspects of socialism and, you know, with good aspects of capitalism, we can remove the bad aspects of socialism. And vice versa. For example, I did understand, like, there are certain things that we could not leave to the private market because the private market has shown that it has failed. We gave the private market a chance to fix climate change, and instead it is choosing to make it worse. So we'll have no other option but giving it to, like, the state to handle. We've shown that it has failed in regards to keeping people healthy, in regards to a lot of things, so it's best that we fix that as well. But then I was also like, oh, but we do see what the government taking too much control over would be bad. And, you know, with the typical thing where it's like, private enterprises can lead to more competition, which leads to better products. But then I also added the caveat, of course, where it's like, but if it gets too much and we have a monopoly, then the government's going to have to step in to try and fix that. But then, as the world just kept going around, the good aspects of capitalism just started dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. And all the arguments that were used to sort of debunk socialism just kept being debunked, as I've seen. Like, I think the second that the whole, like, competition breeds innovation argument was sort of debunked for me, I kind of, like, fully was just like, yeah, this just don't work. Which is ironic, because, like, I had that argument explained to me many, many times beforehand, not even related to, like, socialism versus capitalism, but showing that it just really does not work. Like, I mean, one of the biggest things you need to understand about, like, capitalism breeds innovation, and innovation and whatever, it just doesn't work because it's just, like, one of the biggest ways you can see this is, I use this example a lot, and nobody's told me that it's a bad example, so I keep using it, but notice how every single soda company has the same soda brands. Well, they don't have the same soda brands, obviously, but they have the same soda flavors. They have the brown soda, They have the citrus soda. They have the soda that can be many different flavors. They have the green soda. And right now, you are currently thinking, oh yeah, like Coke, Pepsi, Fanta, Sunkist, Mountain Dew, Mallow Yellow. And each soda company literally creates sodas to rip off the other soda companies. Dr. Pepper rolls in. All of a sudden, you got Mr. Pibb, which is a superior product, by the way. Not dissing Dr. Pepper, just Mr. Pibb has you beat. Mountain Dew is a very popular soda brand. Boom! All of a sudden, Coke invents Surge. Same thing is said for the entertainment industry, which I guess apparently some people say we shouldn't talk about because they're currently on strike. Maybe we shouldn't talk about future products, but products that currently exist I think are fair game. Movies and TV shows, the second there's a popular thing, all of a sudden, every single other studio has that thing. SpongeBob comes out, boom, Coconut Fred. Shrek comes out, boom, Hoodwinked. And while we're at it, boom again, Enchanted. Marvel comes out with their cinematic universe, boom, all of a sudden DC starts making a cinematic universe. Now all of a sudden, every single studio wants to make a cinematic universe. And they literally just decided to copy every single Marvel movie that was coming out at the time period. Marvel releases Guardians of the Galaxy, all of a sudden, DC's got Suicide Squad. Captain America Civil War, Batman v Superman. There's a famous video about, like, on Game Theory where it talks about gamers don't want innovation, where he literally shows that if you go by certain series being released and then look at their most popular games in each series, you see objectively that the ones that copy the same formula are the ones that do the best. And all of the ones that do innovations just don't really live up to expectations. Speaking of, Smash Bros. Second Smash Bros. Came out, now all of a sudden everybody wants to do a tournament fighter of their intellectual properties. Sony tried to do one, Nickelodeon tried to do one, Cartoon Network tried to do one, Mario Kart, all of a sudden everybody's got a Mario Kart now. Not really innovating, do we? And I didn't even get to mention the point that the media industries that we currently have basically just rehashed the whole same intellectual properties over and over and over again. Yeah, really innovating the industry, guys. So yeah, capitalism doesn't really do a lot of innovating, to be honest. I actually do remember, like, when I was still in that sort of like sockdem phase where it was like funny, where it was like, I remember when Evo Morales was initially running for re-election, I saw a lot of people that I knew like sort of like backing him, but I was a little hesitant because I was like, scary socialism. But then literally the following year, since the situation got so bad, I basically just full-heartedly backed Mas, and now I regard Evo Morales as one of, if not the, greatest leaders in the history of civilization. I would probably go with the one of, just because there are decently a couple of people to choose from, all of which are socialists. And in preparation for this video, I actually decided to take the political compass again and compare the results that I got recently with the results of my first political compass that I took on this channel. See, when I first made this channel and first posted a political compass test on this channel, my results were negative 6.25 for economics and negative 5.64 on social issues. The most recent one I took, I was negative 9.5 on economics and negative 7.85 on social issues. Yeah, very noticeably, I am more left-wing. Another funny one is communism. You see, because communism, of course, like, even early on, like, even when I was sort of, like, changing, like, to be more socialistic, I was like, like, the communism question was a bit interesting because it was really difficult. Like, am I a communist now? Broadly, I would still say no, and I don't think that'll change. The new turn of phrase that I use is, I don't hate communism, I hate communists. The phrase is intentionally making fun of the fact that a lot of modern day communists or communists in general just sort of have this really weird thing about them. Like, a lot of modern day communists, I guess nowadays, you know, you would just call them tankies. Not really communists, but like, a lot of the tanky individuals really do make communism just not look good. Like when you're called like a fascist by like 15 different people with hammer and sickle emojis, and then one of them basically threatens your life by saying like they'll throw me in a gulag, and then all of them just start liking it and be like, lol, lol. It's like they kind of just don't make communism look good. Now, of course, it's a misnomer because it's like historical communists. It's a bit of a different story. Some of which are good, some of which are bad. Like for example, like when I say I hate communists, I don't really mean people like Che Guevara, because Che Guevara is objectively cool and based. Just looking into any info about him kind of like disseminates all the sort of like Western. We'll actually get to that in a bit, but the one thing that I should just say for this one, because this is the only one that I'm actually going to try to explain myself. I mean, I'm going to try to explain myself on a lot of things, but this one is like, why? Like, why did I shift further left? I attribute it to really three things. For starters, the world being so shit that really staying a social democrat in the modern world just does not make sense. Like, the solutions I maintain that the solutions back then that I was suggesting for the world back then probably would still be good for the world back then, but we're in a different world now. The situation has vastly changed. So that at that point, 2018 he does not have the answers to 2023 world problems. So logistically, it would not make sense to hold the exact same positions that you held back then. Now, I'm not even really saying like, ideological differences. Like, there are some people who could still ideologically identify the same way that they do back then, but I guarantee you that your broader interpretations in your head, they're sort of different than they were back then. Next was sort of me looking into more radical figures and ideas and actually not really finding them that objectionable. Like, for example, I literally just decided to buy the Communist Manifesto and bought Das Kapital to just read them. I have not read Capital yet. Too big brain for me. But I read the manifesto, and it's just like, literally, just none of this stuff is really that radical. And the last thing is actually funny. Like, the last one can actually be summed up with one single person. Andrés Manuel López Obrador. AMLO, I believe, really sort of opened the door, because AMLO was sort of like the kicking stone to going to look into the pink tide and looking into those more radical figures, at least comparatively to AMLO. AMLO's a good stepping stone to look into further left-wing figures. Like with AMLO's associations with a lot of other left-wing leaders, it does lead you to looking into that kind of ideology. And, of course, just general research. The next thing that I changed was that when I started this channel, I used to think that I was a straight ally. Ha 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 ha. No further comment. Ha ha ha. Next one. I no longer believe in the death penalty. That's what I've talked about before. I wanted to, of course, massively reform the process to getting the death penalty, but I ultimately believed that in some circumstances, the death penalty was the only option. Then I watched the John Oliver episode about the death penalty, and I was just like, I just cannot, in good faith, support the death penalty after watching this episode. If you haven't watched it, by all means, you should. It goes into how the death penalty is just objectively a terrible punishment. It is not really a good deterrent. It goes into statistics of how many people die unlawfully due to the death penalty. And it just shows you, like, just point blank how bad the death penalty really is. And the fact that a modern day society still has the death penalty in this form is just, like, terrible. The next thing I changed on is wars. Originally, when you're a lefty on, like, Twitter or YouTube or whatever, originally, it seems that the only wars that people really have a problem with are Vietnam and Iraq. And I think a lot of Americans broadly have that sort of same mentality, where it's like, they really only consider, like, Iraq and Vietnam failures. Those are the only wars that they consider bad, and that all the rest of them are broadly okay or beneficial to America. But then when you actually look into all of the wars, as I have, you soon realize that in the history of America, only 4 conflicts in the history of America have been justified. The Revolutionary War, because we were fighting for our independence. The War of 1812, because British aggression was forcing the US to take action. The Civil War, because we needed to end slavery. And World War II, because we needed to fight the Nazis. Every other war the United States has been involved in was not a good war and was a mistake for the US to get involved in. And I don't even really think that the Vietnam War or the Iraq War are the biggest mistakes in US foreign policy anymore. I believe that World War I was the biggest mistake in US foreign policy. I mean, outside of Latin American coups, but I guess they technically don't count as failures because they were successful. But World War I is generally like one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes for the United States in its history. It is a mistake for the world's foreign policies. It is arguably one of the deadliest wars in the history of the world. World War II only eclipses it in how you count the death count. You see, because the thing about World War II is that it actually includes a ton of different wars all across the world into one. Which, of course, the name would suggest. And one of the big things that makes the number of World War I seem smaller is because they do not include the deaths of the Spanish flu, when the Spanish flu's deaths are intrinsically linked to World War I. Due to World War I being around the world, many governments around the world silenced any information in regards to the Spanish flu. That's why it's called the Spanish flu, because Spain was the only country that was permitted to discuss the flu, a flu pandemic that killed over 100 million people. That, combined with the roughly 40 million people that were expected to have died in the conflict itself, puts the death toll at around 140 million deaths, which eclipses World War II's 80 million deaths. Though to be fair, you have to kind of factor in a lot of other things, and I think I want to make a video where I talk about how World War I was a mistake, and I do want to use more accurate numbers, which would include a range. But speaking of foreign policy, another thing that has changed about my foreign policy stance is sort of, well, this one's not really more of an actual like substantive policy difference, but I guess really it's like a identification for the term. Like when I was originally starting out this channel, I used the term non-interventionist to describe myself. But I realized that term isn't really necessarily the best way to describe an actual left-winger on foreign policy. That one's more used to describe a right-winger on foreign policy, because it really stems from not intervention just only because we do not want to intervene personally. Basically, the terminology just didn't make sense. So the term that I use to describe myself now is a radical pacifist. I skipped the phrase of calling myself anti-imperialist, even though that's probably the actual correct term that I could use, because that term was already bastardized by the likes of Richard Medhurst and Jimmy Dore. So it's just I kind of skipped that phase. The next difference in regards to foreign policy, I guess not really the last thing, but another thing that is about foreign policy that I've sort of changed my mind on, and I say sort of because this is really a very slim difference, really, is regarding NATO. Originally, I consider myself softly pro-NATO. Now, I guess I'm softly anti-NATO. Functionally, there's no difference because the outcome is still relatively the same. Ideally, I would want a post-NATO world, but we're not at the point where NATO can be abolished. So really, we're stuck with NATO for the time being. And the last thing that is sort of foreign policy based is that I am very less America-centric than I once was. When I started this channel, I was very fascinated in the American political scene, but for many reasons, I guess I kind of got bored with America, so I started looking outwards and started seeing a lot more interesting political figures. Again, one of this is really stemming from AMLO, who introduced me to a lot of the Pink Tide leaders. And I still do find a lot of fascinating figures in America. Like, I just did research and found out that there was a U.S. Senator by the name of Harry Lane, who was essentially a fellow traveler of the American Socialist Party, because he had a child in the Socialist Party. He hired her husband, who was also a member of the Socialist Party. He co-sponsored bills with the Socialist congressman at the time, Meyer London. He advocated for a lot of socialist causes, albeit ones that aren't necessarily, like, definitively socialistic-minded. Like, I mean, I guess they are socialistic-minded because he was, like, anti-imperialist. But, you know, it was still in a realm where it was, like, he had plausible deniability. But I do find myself a lot more fascinated with foreign, like, elections and figures now than, say, back in the day, where I would probably have to be pushed into even talking about a foreign election. Related, but my YouTube branding sort of has a different meaning now. You see, since I was, again, America-centric, the name of this channel and the color scheme were made because I was a American politics historian channel, I guess. Now that I've shifted to be a lot more of a lefty-oriented thing, the color scheme and name is supposed to be a trick. Like, you go in expecting some, like, generic historical channel, and then you sort of, like, see left-wing ideas, and then people will then be pushed into left-wing ideas. And in a way, it did work. There's a member of my server who, when he first met my content, he was a paleocon, now he's a liberal at the very least. And I take a lot of credit in doing so. The next position that I've changed my mind on is drugs. Originally, I was just a legalized weed guy. Now I think decriminalizing all drug use is the more reasonable option. The next issue I changed my mind on, which also coincidentally involves needles, vaccines. Originally, I didn't believe in vaccine mandates. I thought that a majority of people would be smart enough to get vaccinated without the need for a, like, vaccine mandate. And I figured that the people who didn't get vaccinated, the situation would sort itself out. But then, COVID-19 happened, and basically we got, vaccine policy got explained so much so, that's just like, at this point, literally, I think vaccine mandates are 100% required, especially for children. Like, vaccines are very much, like, a vaccine. I honestly can't understand how you can look at the COVID policy of the United States and then go, the problem was we had too strict of a COVID policy and we needed to lessen certain things. It's like honestly, I can't even see how you can look at the COVID situation and not immediately go, vaccine mandates are the only option in the future. But there are people who still believe, who still maintain their belief system that the government or the doctors or the elite were proven wrong about COVID, when it was like, they were never proven. In fact, they were proven wrong on COVID because the elite didn't want people to take COVID seriously. The next issue that I've sort of changed my mind on is trans rights. Now, to be clear, I was never anti-trans. I never will be anti-trans. I have always been a transgender ally. But the difference was, I was a lot more ignorant on trans issues, particularly in regards to ones that were not, quote-unquote, clear-cut as male to female and female to male. You know, non-binary, gender fluid, the demis, you know, demi-boy, demi-girl. I still supported the rights of people who identified that way. I was just really ignorant on a lot of them, and maybe some of them I was in that mindset of, like, you know, you're just making things up, but I was also in the mindset of, like, they're allowed to do that if they want. Like, I didn't really see any problem with someone identifying as a demi-boy or a demi-girl, even if I thought that they were, like, making it up or something. Now I understand that they wouldn't make it up, but I also understand a lot of other things. Like, another thing that I was confused about was sort of like the whole idea of, like, well, bottom surgery, but it's like, I now am more adept on these issues than I once was. I've become so adept on trans rights, I am now a chaser. Anyways, next issue, which is somewhat related, the SJWs were right all along. You see, This channel was sort of made directly after the anti-SJW craze was starting to die, and I was sort of still in that vein. Like, you can't really deny the skeptic community's hold on the online political left. The online political left and the online political right nowadays are both heavily inspired by the skeptic community. For better and for worse, they really are very influential in this sphere. And I was an avid viewer of the anti-SJW YouTubers, or the skeptic community. I guess I really shouldn't say, like, I was an avid viewer, because I didn't watch all of them, but basically, let me explain the ones I did watch. I watched TJ Kirk, The Amazing Atheist. I watched Armored Skeptic. I watched Chris Ray Gun. And I watched Cult of Dusty. And I think there were, like, a couple other ones sprinkled in here and there. Maybe, like, there was this one guy I was sub to briefly called Easy on Me, who was sort of in the skeptic community sphere. I occasionally watched Hunter Avalon videos, even though Hunter Avalon was, like, a pretty decent conservative. Freedom Tunes, like, Freedom Tunes was started out as, like, an anti-SJW YouTuber, but then he just sort of shifted hard right, even though he was already a libertarian. Like, you get my point. Like, it was in the sphere, and even the left-wing YouTubers I did watch, which I guess a lot of those guys are technically left-wing YouTubers, but even the left-wing YouTubers that I did watch, like Kyle Kalinske, and even YouTubers that were not politically oriented at all, like the Sleepy Cabin crew, they were all anti-SJWs. Like, a lot of prominent YouTubers were anti-SJWs, so it was like, it was really hard to escape that culture. And I had that culture within my mind as I was starting the YouTube channel. The influence is still there in sort of my content and whatever, and it's part of my political journey that I can never take away. But it's definitely a lot different now that I've actually looked into a lot of these problems directly. Like, when I looked into Gamergate, I really did start to realize all of this, like, Gamergate, all of this anti-SJW talk was just like, this was all literally because of nothing. Like, literally, let me explain. If you guys don't know, Gamergate was started because a person named Zoe Quinn wanted to make a game, and that game got high reviews. And because of it, an ex of theirs claimed that Zoe was sleeping around to get favors, to get positive reviews, which then caused a ton of people to attack Zoe, claiming that Zoe was trying to ruin the industry. And then when people rushed to Zoe's defense, they were then branded with the term SJWs, and because of that, we somehow have Nazis roaming the streets and very prominent members of the Republican Party. Hopefully, if the Patreon does well, I'll be able to make the big magnum opus video that I want that will show all of this in more detail. But yeah, this kind of showed the SJWs were right all along, even in some of the things that you would think, like, even some of the things that I thought back in the day, like, I would never say, like saying that the demi boys and demi girls are completely valid. That would be, back in the day, that would have been me thinking, like, oh, the SJWs are winning. Just admitting that a gender identity is correct would be me thinking that the SJWs were winning. And when they said, like, a lot of these are far-right creators and all this movement is started by, like, far-right people, it's like, then at the time you're like, no, that's not true. It's like, that's 100% true. The far-right propped up Gamergate, even though they claim that they don't like gamers. Sargon is now a literal far-right talking head. And I guess while I'm at it, I guess I'll transition to this, because this is sort of like the same thing. Like Oedipal is 100% bad. I reject that notion now, because it's just like, what identity politics is defined as back in the day is not really the same thing that you actually look into when you actually read the little textbook definition of Oedipal. And that is also not just because of the anti-SJW thing, but that was also a pretty prominent thought in the, I guess, the Jimmy Dore, Kyle Kalinske post-left thing. I guess that's what you call them. Like, let's all try to figure out, like, what do we call them, literally? Like, what do we call that group of people? The post-left? The dumb left? Like, what do we call them? But I'm basically going to use this brief section to outline basically all of the theories espoused by that crowd that I did buy into. Like, for example, the Russiagate stuff. It's like, doing research, I see Russiagate's a lot more gray than I thought it was. Like, it wasn't, like, cut and dry. And they basically just pretended it was cut and dry, so it really looked like that. And it could also be because liberals sort of painted it in that broad sense, like black and white. But again, it is a lot more gray than you actually think about when you first see it. I believed in the whole, like, if the left populists and the right populists work together, and it was like, that was stupid. I really, like, in retrospect, it's just like, that is a really stupid idea, and I've explained why that's a stupid idea many times. But these are the two that are like, uh-oh, like, when you hear these, it's like, yikes, because it's like, yeah, I did, and I'll explain why I believed them in a bit, but first I'll just say what the first one is. I was one of the people who was thinking, like, because I would watch the Jimmy Dore show, I'd watch Kyle Kulinski, and they would pose one simple question. Why would Bashar al-Assad gas his own people? Like, they would say, like, why is he gassing his own people? And why would he do that immediately after he negotiates the Obama administration to leave Syria? Like, why would he do that? That makes no sense. Maybe, hypothetically, this isn't exactly what we think it is. Now, that one is bad enough, but technically, you could see the lines that were there. You could see the information that was readily available that could make you question that narrative. But this last one is one that is just like, I did buy it. I don't know for how long I bought it, but I do remember at one point buying it. And I think, and I'm pretty sure there is an episode where I did say that I believed this. And it's probably one of the biggest ones in this sort of sphere. I did, at one point, believe the Seth Rich conspiracy theories. Yeah, like, legitimately, I'll just say it. I did at one point believe in the Seth Rich conspiracy theories. Because the people who were spreading this conspiracy theory sold it on a silver platter. It was the right time, at the right place, for people to think like that. They wanted an excuse to hate Hillary. And they wanted an excuse to prove the DNC's rigging, which did happen. They wanted something there to prove that it was a bigger conspiracy than it actually would be. They wanted, like, clear-cut things to show, like, this is big and this is big, big, big. And how else do you show that other than painting this person with the, like, literal best brush you could paint him with to that crowd? Like, I mean, literally, like, the people who are right-wing, they already believe that Hillary Clinton murders people, but then you need to get the Bernie people on board, and the only way to do that is to make it seem like the person that she killed directly was on your side, and that's what they did. They painted it. And Julian Assange also helped that, because he kept always denying that Seth Rich was the person who leaked it. Like, literally, they'd be like, hey, did Seth Rich do the leaks? And he'd be like, I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe I ask people for information in regards to Seth Rich's death. I don't know. Like, I mean, why else would I, like, try to get people to investigate Seth Rich? But he was just stoking the fires. It's like, why? This makes no sense. Why are you stoking the fires? And it stinks, but it's just like, it is what it is. I believed it. Now I don't, because literally just looking into it any further just shows how wrong it is. And anyways, next thing, when I first started this channel, I originally intended to be 100% independent of every single party, organization, or whatever, no matter what. Now I am a registered member of Democratic Socialists of America. I felt that it made sense as a socialist or democratic socialist to support the most powerful, largest socialist organization to help socialism grow, even if it is only by a little. And now we'll move on to this part, like figures, like, because these are like some figures that I've changed my mind on a lot of things. See, because originally I liked some people and hated others, but now those might be switched. Maybe I like certain people now or hate them now. So first, let's start off with figures that I liked at one point in the original, like, videos, and now that I don't like them. First off, the biggest one, Tim Canova. Tim Canova literally just fell off the deep end, and he's now a crazy right-wing nutcase. Jimmy Dore, same situation. Glenn Greenwald, same situation. Kyle Kalinske, not really the same situation, but he's definitely like cringe. Tulsi Gabbard, extremely same situation as Tim Canova. Jesse Ventura, not case. Ciro Gomez, originally, back in the day, I did like, because he was a social democrat, and I was like, scary socialism. So, I was like, Ciro Gomez is cool. And this isn't a person I really liked at the beginning. Like, this was a person I kind of like started to find fascination with. Hold on. Did he? Yeah, I think, yeah. During the first year, I think, yes. Alan Grayson. Basically, I would look up Alan Grayson clips on YouTube, and I would see how Alan Grayson was, and I'd be like, ooh, this guy's really cool. And I was like, he's running for another term? Even though he left? I would be interested to see Alan Grayson come back. But Alan Grayson, his is the most interesting because he's sort of like the weirdest thing. Like, he's the closest thing to like sort of like just a normal liberal, like Democrat politician. So he has a lot of issues in regards to finances and a lot of other things. But another thing that is interesting that I looked into was sort of what he did in the most recent election that he was in. Okay, so first there was like a story that broke where it was like when he was running for Senate in 2022, it was discovered that he started an anti-Trump super PAC, and then in turn that PAC would just be funneling money into his 2018 House bid. So I was like, this guy's kind of cringe. I'm out. But then, when he went to go file in the Florida District 10 race against Maxwell Frost, that's when things got a little more interesting, because Alan Grayson was accused, because during the campaign, Maxwell Frost there was a smear campaign against him, claiming that he sexually harassed people over the phone, and then a letter was taped to the house of Maxwell Frost's family, and Maxwell Frost said that the person who did it was affiliated with the Alan Grayson campaign, making it clear that Alan Grayson really just wants to get dirty with the campaigns. And he did it with the 2018 campaign, too, where he was being very mean about Darren Soto's wife because she got drunk and was left at like a thing. And he was basically making that a part of his debate performance, and everyone was just like, dude, don't do that. I find it very ironic, considering Alan Grayson's political career was considered ruined when he faced a sexual harassment allegation when he ran for Senate in 2016. But I guess it's okay when you do it, but not when anyone else does it. Figures that I hated, that I now like, are Castro and Lenin, because history paints them in a very bad light. Then when you do research, you realize, they're not that bad. Castro definitely has more flaws than, say, Lenin, or, they both have flaws, and you can argue that those flaws are bad. They are flaws. But honestly, I do think that these two, they have a lot more things to, at least evenly, things to praise and things to, decry. In that same vein, we have some historical figures that I wasn't really taught to hate, but for some reason, the education and media system, they're not kind to them, but I never really hated these guys. Karl Marx, Malcolm X, Che Guevara, and Hugo Chavez. Basically, if I went anywhere else, then I would have, probably hated them. I didn't know much about Chavez to really hate him. I did know that, Venezuela was not really, looked upon fondly. Because, to be honest, I didn't even know about Venezuela until the 2018 political crisis. And by then, the narrative was already spun, to me, by, rightfully, that the Western media was trying to make Venezuela seem, worse than it actually is. So I knew, this is not really, I'm not really going to take them, 100% when they give criticisms of Venezuela. Che was the figure that was never really talked about. I really only figured out about him because I would just see some clips, people hey, why do you have shirts of Che Guevara? He is a murderer. And that's really all I knew. So it's that's really all I had to go off of. And, I guess I did give criticisms, he did murder people, but I was I didn't really know much about Che Guevara personally. Then when I ended up doing research into Che Guevara, I was he's actually pretty good. The one that the school system is probably not, the least kind to is Malcolm X, because they always say, oh, Malcolm X is, the bad one. Martin Luther King Jr. was the good one because he wanted to, help everybody. Malcolm X was the bad one because he wanted like black separation. Then you look into it and you realize it's not necessarily the most accurate picture you could paint of Malcolm X. But, you know, it is what it is. And Marx, the education system, it's just they really kind of ignore Marx, but then also paint him in like the weirdest light, where they basically just say like, oh, Marx mentored Lenin, who mentored Stalin. And it's basically the only information they give you. And I don't even know if the history books really do say like, oh, he was just read Karl Marx and then that's what inspired him, or if they say like, oh, he was literally inspiring Lenin like directly. But how I always interpreted it was Marx, then Lenin, then Stalin. And probably the last and biggest change from the beginning of this channel to now is I am not as keen on third parties as I once was. I still like a lot of third parties, and I think they have a lot of prominence in the US political history, but modern day ones are not really that cool. Like, I'm not really interested in the modern day aspects of third parties. I think basically every single third party that exists nowadays is kind of trash. Like, I mean, early on, I was a fan of the US Green Party, but now I legitimately cannot stand them. Like, I mean, have you seen their 2020, campaign? Have you seen it at all? I've talked about it a lot, and that whole primary process is just so bad that it's just like, of the 8 people they ran, 5 are absolute garbage. They somehow let, and the fact of the matter is, of those 5, 3 had literally no prior history within the Green Party. 2 had a history, but was a short history. And it's just like, somehow they let these 5 grifters, they literally just take over their entire narrative, upend every single quote-unquote success they could have potentially had for stupid vanity projects for podcasts, just so they can have their big story. Literally just so, Chad Wilson, how did they let Chad Wilson control their 2020 narrative? And although I ultimately do want a third party, a left-wing independent party, ultimately I do want that, I don't really see the point in really advocating for that at this point. We don't have the ability, we don't have the time or money, or the resource, we don't have any of the things needed to create another third party. We do not have any of the stuff needed to do so. This is stuff that we should have been doing literally 5 years ago. Literally, if you wanted to build a third party, 2018 was the time to do it. Now, 2023, we do not have the time to build a third party from scratch, or to waste our time in these third party endeavors. Now, that doesn't mean don't vote for a third party candidate at all, or don't vote for a third party candidate ever. There are many reasons why you would, and sometimes should, vote for an independent or third-party candidate. But we really do not have the time to, build a new infrastructure for a third party that will ultimately not really accomplish anything because we do not, again, have the time or energy to build the infrastructure needed. Do you really understand how much time and energy we would need to build a third party from scratch? We would need to get all the resources to literally file that party. Then we need to get volunteers. Then, in order to make sure that the party is relevant, we need to get people all across the United States to get involved. We need to make sure we have a lineup of candidates. We need to make sure we can turn out people to vote for us consistently so that we don't get off the ballot. We need people to make merch. We need people to make all this stuff. It's we don't have the time. And that's not even to the point where we can actually run. We're not even at the point where we can actually run, and we still have so much time left. Bernie Sanders took 10 years to build a viable political base in Vermont. 10 years in one tiny ass state. And yet you're going to say, oh, we need to do this nationwide. It's I would love that. But the only way for a third party in the United States, a left-wing third party to exist in the United States and be viable, would be if the Working Families Party and DSA would actually merge their resources to form a viable multi-party, multi-tendency group across the United States. That is the only way that we could have a viable third party in the United States. And even then, we would probably lose one election cycle trying to maintain all the resources needed. Those are the only two left-wing organizations in the United States that have enough power. And we'd probably need more help. We need Justice Democrats. We need brand new Congress. Well, we don't need brand new Congress anymore. They're dead. We would need a bunch of progressive groups to join in the fray. We'd probably need the support of a bunch of other left-wing parties across the United States. We don't have the time, and they're not going to join together regardless. So what's the point? So anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say on this. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you want more content from me, you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.